The year is 1965. The location is not a battlefield, not the summit hall, not a trading floor. It is the cargo hold of an Air France Boeing 707, parked quietly on the tarmac at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. To anyone watching from a distance, nothing seems unusual. Fuel trucks hum beside the aircraft, pumping kerosene for an overnight transatlantic flight. Baggage handlers move with practiced indifference, tossing suitcases onto conveyor belts. Passengers wait in the terminal, unaware that history is being loaded beneath their feet. But inside the secured cargo bay, this is not a normal flight, surrounded by armed guards from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Workers are loading something far heavier than luggage. These are not suitcases. They are reinforced wooden crates, bound tightly with steel bands, stacked with extreme precision. Inside each crate are gold bar standard good delivery bars cast at 99.5% purity, each weighing exactly 400 troy ounces. Every bar is stamped with the official seal of the United States Assay Office. This gold is not being stolen. There is no heist, no criminals, no disguises. What is happening here is far more unsettling. This is a bank run, but not by panicked citizens lining up outside a failing bank. This is a bank run executed by a sovereign state. And the man orchestrating it is not a financier or a speculator, but the President of the French Republic himself, General Charles de Gaulle. For months, these flights have been leaving New York under the cover of routine air traffic. Night after night, ton after ton, America's gold is quietly departing its vaults. Each takeoff drains the reserves that sit at the very foundation of the global financial system. Inside the corridors of the LEC Palace in Paris, the operation has a name, Operation 19. Its objective is brutally simple. France is reclaiming its wealth. Billions of dollars worth of French reserves once stored at the Federal Reserve in New York are being physically repatriated to the limestone vaults of the Banque de France in Paris, not in promises, not in paper, in metal. Washington is furious. President Lyndon B. Johnson is reportedly apoplectic, raging to his advisers about what he sees as French betrayal. American troops are stationed across Europe, defending NATO's borders, bleeding in distant conflicts, and now France is, in his words, stabbing America in the back, inside the U.S. Treasury. Panic is spreading. Officials watch in disbelief as America's gold stock once thought untouchable hemorrhages millions of dollars per day. This gold is not merely an asset. It is the anchor of the entire post-war monetary order, and it is leaving. What is unfolding in 1965 is not an isolated dispute between allies. It is the climax of a silent economic war that has been building for 2 decades, a war between paper promises and physical reality, between political power and monetary discipline, between the exorbitant privilege of the U.S. dollar and the supreme, indifferent law of gold. To understand why France sent planes and not armies to raid America's vaults, and how this single act helped destroy the global gold standard and give birth to the modern era of fiat money, we must go back to the beginning. Back to a quiet hotel in New Hampshire. Back to 1944. Back to the moment when the rules of the financial world were rewritten. To understand how gold ended up on French airplanes leaving New York, we need to return to a very different moment in history. The year is 1944. The place is the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Outside, the world is still at war. Europe is a smoking ruin. Entire cities lie flattened, industrial capacity has been shattered. Empires that once ruled half the globe are drowning in debt. Inside the hotel, however, 44 allied nations gather to plan something unprecedented, a new global financial order. The United States arrives at this meeting holding all the cards, unlike Europe or Japan. America's factories are intact, its cities are untouched, its economy has been turbocharged by wartime production, and most importantly, The United States holds nearly 70% of all the world's monetary gold reserves. It is an almost unimaginable concentration of wealth. Gold, at this moment, is not just another commodity, it is money itself. It is the final settlement asset. Whoever controls the gold controls the system, and so the system is built around America. The architects of Bretton Woods design a structure that appears elegant, stable, even benevolent. The world, exhausted by depression and war, needs certainty, it needs trust, it needs an anchor. That anchor becomes the US dollar, under the Bretton Woods Agreement. The dollar is fixed to gold at a rate of $35 per ounce. Every other major currency, the French franc, the British pound, the German mark, is pegged to the dollar. Gold sits at the top. The dollar sits just beneath it. Every other currency rests below. It is, in effect, a pyramid of trust. Here is how it works. A French exporter sells wine to the United States. He is paid in dollars. He takes those dollars to a French bank and exchanges them for francs. The Banque de France then holds the dollars as part of its foreign reserves. And here is the critical promise, the sacred oath of Bretton Woods. At any time, any foreign central bank can take those dollars, walk up to the U.S. Treasury's gold window, and demand conversion into physical gold. $35 in paper go in. 1 ounce of gold comes out. No questions asked. The dollar is, in theory, as good as gold. For the first 15 years, the system works remarkably well. The world is desperate for dollars. Europe needs American machinery, American steel, American food. Dollars flow outward, rebuilding shatter economies. This period is known as the dollar shortage. But systems built on imbalance rarely stay stable forever. By the late 1950s, the miracle has run its course. European factories are roaring back to life. German industry is hyper-efficient. French manufacturing is modernized. Japan is rising. Europe no longer needs to import everything from America. Yet America keeps spending. The United States begins running massive balance of payments deficits. It prints dollars to maintain military bases in Germany and Japan. It prints dollars to fund foreign aid. It prints dollars to finance corporate acquisitions of European companies. Most significantly, it prints dollars to fight wars. The world is soon flooded with green paper, and this is where the fatal contradiction appears. A Belgian economist named Robert Triffin notices something deeply wrong. He articulates a paradox that will later bear his name, the Triffin dilemma. For the global economy to grow, Triffin explains, the world needs liquidity. It needs dollars. That means the United States must run deficits and send dollars abroad. But the more deficits America runs, the more dollars pile up in foreign central banks. Eventually, the number of paper dollar claims held overseas will exceed the amount of gold sitting in U.S. vaults. At that moment, the promise at the heart of Bretton Woods becomes mathematically impossible to keep. By 1960, that moment arrives. Foreign governments now hold more dollar claims than the United States has gold to redeem them. If everyone were to demand their gold at once, the U.S. Treasury would be insolvent. The dollar is still officially as good as gold, but in reality, it has become a promise that cannot be honored. And in Paris, someone is paying very close attention. If Charles de Gaulle was the sword in this story, then Jacques Rueff was the mind that guided it. Rueff was not a radical, not a populist, and certainly not a revolutionary. He was an old-school economist in the most literal sense of the term, a man shaped by the financial collapses of the interwar period, a believer in discipline, balance, and consequences. To Rueff, money was not a tool of politics. It was a moral contract, and when he examined the Bretton Woods system, he saw not stability, but a deception hidden in plain sight. Rueff understood something that most policymakers preferred not to see. The gold exchange standard had created a two-tier world. For ordinary countries, France, Italy, Britain, deficits were painful when they imported more than they exported. Gold ore reserves flowed out. Interest rates had to rise. Budgets had to tighten. Governments felt the pressure of reality. But the United States lived in a different universe. Because the dollar sat at the center of the system, America could run deficits without consequence. When the U.S. bought foreign goods, it did not pay in gold. It paid in its own currency. Those dollars flowed into foreign central banks, and instead of demanding gold, those central banks quietly reinvested the dollars back into U.S. Treasury bonds, earning interest while financing American spending. Ruff had a name for this phenomenon. He called it deficits without tears to explain it. He offered a parable so simple it was devastating. If I have an agreement with my tailor, Ruff said, that whatever money I pay him, he returns to me the very same day as a loan, then I would have no objection at all to ordering more suits from him. The United States, Ruff argued, had discovered a magical power in international finance. It could buy the world's goods, assets, and companies with paper it never truly intended to repay. Other nations labored. America printed. The cost of this imbalance was not borne in Washington. It was exported abroad, in the form of inflation and lost sovereignty. When Charles de Gaulle returned to power in 1958, Ruff became his most trusted economic advisor. De Gaulle was not an economist, but he was obsessed with independence. He had lived through the humiliation of occupation. He had watched France become strategically subordinate to the United States after the war. He had already clashed with Washington over nuclear weapons, NATO command structures, and foreign policy autonomy. Now Ruff was telling him something far more dangerous. The American dollar itself was a tool of empire. Ruff explained that every dollar France held in its reserves was, in effect, a loan to the United States. Those dollars helped finance American military bases on European soil. They enabled U.S. corporations to acquire French industries. They subsidized policies over which France had no control. Worse still, as American spending accelerated, particularly with the escalation of the Vietnam War, Ruff warned that France was paying for a conflict it fundamentally opposed. Inflation caused by American deficits was being exported across the Atlantic. France worked hard to earn trade surpluses, and yet the real value of those surpluses was being silently eroded by Washington's printing press. To de Gaulle, this was intolerable. A nation that cannot control its money, he believed, cannot be truly sovereign, and so the first shots of the war were fired not with speeches, not with threats, but with quiet transactions. In 1960 and 1963, France began slowly converting its growing stockpile of dollars into gold. No announcements, no drama, just a steady flow of requests at the U.S. Treasury's gold window. The signal was subtle, but unmistakable. Washington noticed. At first, American officials believed the situation could be managed. Diplomacy would smooth things over. Incentives would keep France in line. They sent Under-Secretary of the Treasury Robert Rousseau to Paris with a proposal. The United States would issue special bonds, so-called Rousseau bonds, denominated in foreign currencies. These instruments were designed to give central banks a reason to hold dollars without converting them into gold. France purchased some, but they kept buying gold too, and by 1965, subtlety gave way to confrontation. The Cold War of finance was about to turn hot. By early 1965, the polite language of diplomacy was no longer enough. For years, France had signaled its unease quietly, converting dollars into gold behind closed doors, testing the limits of American patience. But Charles de Gaulle understood something fundamental about power. If you want to change a system, you must first destroy the illusion that sustains it. On February 4, 1965, de Gaulle summoned the world's press to the Élysée Palace. The atmosphere was electric. More than 1,000 journalists crowded into the hall. Sensing that something unusual was about to happen, de Gaulle appeared not as a modern politician, but as a figure from another age, tall, rigid, wearing his military uniform. Standing beneath the flags of the Republic, he did not use a teleprompter, he did not rush, and he did not soften his words, For nearly an hour, de Gaulle delivered a cold, methodical dissection of the international monetary system. He began by attacking the very foundation of the post-war order, the so-called gold exchange. Standard, he argued, was no longer legitimate. It had been created at a moment when Europe lay in ruins and America dominated the world economy. That moment had passed. Europe was rich again, its industries were rebuilt, its trade balances were strong, and yet, the world's monetary system still revolved around a single national currency. This, de Gaulle declared, was not neutrality, it was dependence. Then came the lines that would echo through the vaults of every central bank in New York and London. He stated that international trade must be conducted, as it was before the great disasters of the 20th century, on an indisputable monetary base, one that does not bear the mark of any particular nation. He paused. What base? He asked. And then he answered his own question. In truth, it is difficult to see any other standard than gold. Gold, he said, never changes its nature. It can be shaped into bars or coins. It has no nationality. It is eternally and universally accepted. No nationality. That phrase was the dagger in a single stroke. De Gaulle stripped the dollar of its moral authority. The dollar, he implied, was American and therefore political. Gold was neutral. Gold was honest. Gold was free. And then he made his challenge explicit. From that day forward, France would settle its international balances in gold. It would demand payment in gold. And it would offer payment in gold. In other words, France would hold the United States to the exact promise it had made in 1944. $35 for 1 ounce of gold. No exceptions, no excuses. The reaction in the United States was immediate and furious. American newspapers labeled de Gaulle an economic saboteur. Editorials in the New York Times accused France of undermining the Western alliance. Politicians warned that Paris was playing into the hands of the Soviet Union. On the floor of the U.S. Senate, Senator Russell Long went even further. If France wanted its gold back, he suggested, perhaps it should also take back the bodies of the American soldiers who had died liberating France in 1944. The hostility was visceral, but de Gaulle was unmoved. He had not come to Washington seeking approval. He had come to enforce a contract. And now that the philosophy had been declared, only one thing remained: execution, because speeches do not move gold, logistics do. Once the speech was over, the real work began. Philosophy can challenge a system. Only logistics can destroy it. There is a popular myth that Charles de Gaulle sent a French battleship into New York Harbor to reclaim France as gold. It is a powerful image, warships docking beneath the Statue of Liberty, cannon barrels pointed at Manhattan. But the reality was both more subtle and far more effective. The French Navy did play a role, but the sheer volume of gold involved made theatrical gestures impractical. A single ship could not carry the weight of what France intended to retrieve. Instead, the Banque de France organized a vast, methodical, multimodal transport operation. For large sea shipments, they used the French ocean liner SS France, one of the largest passenger ships in the world. For sensitive transfers, naval vessels such as the cruiser Colbert were deployed discreetly, but in 1965, the backbone of Operation 19 was not naval power, it was air power. Every week, Air France aircraft departing from JFK were loaded to their maximum safe payload with gold bullion, Boeing 707s designed for speed. Not treasure became flying vaults, the logistics were nightmarish. Gold is brutally dense. A small stack weighs more than most people can imagine. It cannot simply be piled high inside an aircraft. If loaded incorrectly, it would collapse the floor. Engineers had to calculate weight distribution down to the kilogram. Crates were spaced precisely over the wing spars, the strongest structural points of the aircraft. Every flight required special reinforcement, inspection, and security coordination. The insurance alone was staggering. Never before had so much concentrated wealth been flown across the Atlantic on a routine schedule. Each aircraft carried values that dwarfed the annual budgets of small nations, and the numbers were devastating. In the first half of 1965 alone, the United States lost over $1.6 billion in gold reserves. France was extracting hundreds of millions of dollars per month, and France was not acting alone. By publicly demanding gold, de Gaulle had given other nations permission to think the unthinkable. If the United States could not honor its promise to France, could it honor it to anyone? France's finance minister, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, was the man executing these orders. He would later become president himself. It was Giscard who coined the phrase, exorbitant privilege, to describe the dollar's position. He traveled to Washington to meet with U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Fowler. The meetings were icy. American officials pleaded. They warned that France was destabilizing the free world, that the dollar was the backbone of Western unity, that weakening it handed a strategic victory to the Soviet Union. Giscard listened politely. Then he replied with devastating simplicity. France, he said, was merely following the rules the United States itself had written in 1944. If the dollar was truly as good as gold, why was America so desperate to avoid exchanging it? The pressure on U.S. gold reserves became unbearable. But Washington believed it still had a secret weapon, a mechanism designed not to defend the dollar openly, but to manipulate reality itself. It was called the London Gold Pool. By the early 1960s, American officials understood the danger. They could not openly abandon gold convertibility without detonating the entire Bretton Woods system. But they also could not allow the market price of gold to rise freely. If gold rose above the official price of $35 per ounce, it would expose the lie at the heart of the system. It would signal that the dollar was no longer as good as gold, so they chose a third option: manipulation. In 1961, the United States and its closest allies created a cartel known as the London Gold Pool. Its members included the central banks of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. The objective was simple and ruthless. Whenever the free market price of gold in London rose above roughly $35.20, the pool would intervene. Central banks would collectively sell gold into the market, flooding supply and driving the price back down. This was not price discovery, it was price suppression. The United States supplied half of all the gold used in the pool. The remaining half came from the European members. France contributed roughly 9%. For a time, the scheme worked. But schemes built on finite resources do not endure. As American deficits grew and the Vietnam War escalated, demand for gold intensified. Speculators began testing the pool, buying aggressively whenever gold appeared for sale. Then, in June 1967, Charles de Gaulle made his most lethal move. He realized something crucial. As long as France remained in the gold pool, it was using its own gold to defend the very system it opposed. French reserves were being sacrificed to keep the dollar cheap. So de Gaulle ordered the Banque de France to withdraw quietly. France did not announce its exit. It simply stopped selling. The effect was immediate. The market noticed that 9% of the pool's supply had vanished. Traders smelled weakness. Speculators attacked relentlessly, buying every ounce that London and Washington released. The pool began bleeding gold at an alarming rate. Desperate, the United States turned to Germany. West Germany was the other great industrial power of the era, holding enormous dollar reserves. But, unlike France, Germany was divided and independent. American troops were the only barrier between West Germany and the Soviet Army. The message from Washington was unmistakable. If you want our soldiers, you hold our dollars. In March 1967, the president of the Bundesbank, Karl Blessing, signed what became known as the Blessing Letter. Germany pledged that it would never convert its dollar reserves into gold. It was a surrender. Germany agreed to hold paper forever in exchange for security. De Gaulle mocked this submission openly, referring to the Germans as vassals. By early 1968, The situation was beyond repair. The Tet Offensive in Vietnam shattered any illusion that the war was winding down. U.S. spending exploded. Confidence collapsed. In just 2 weeks, in March 1968, the gold pool lost more than $3 billion in gold, mostly American gold, trying to hold the line at $35. On the evening of Thursday, March 14, 1968, the unimaginable happened. Queen Elizabeth II was woken in the night to sign a royal proclamation declaring the following day a bank holiday. The London gold market was closed. The pool had collapsed. The world's most powerful governments had run out of metal. The closure of the London gold market in March 1968 was not the end. It was the admission of failure. Washington and London scrambled to hold the system together with whatever credibility they had left. Their solution was desperate and revealing: a two-tier gold market. Under this arrangement, central banks would continue to trade gold among themselves at the official price of $35 per ounce, while private citizens would be allowed to buy and sell gold at whatever price the free market demanded. It was an attempt to wall off reality. Official gold would remain frozen in a fantasy world of fixed prices, while the real market floated freely beyond control. The hope was that governments could pretend the system still functioned, even as it visibly fractured. But the illusion was gone. Charles de Gaulle had already won, not by destroying Bretton Woods outright, but by exposing its contradiction. He had shown that the dollar was not gold, only a promise to deliver gold. And when tested, that promise bent, then cracked. De Gaulle did not live to see the final act. He died in 1970, quietly, in his home in Colombia, Les Deux, reportedly playing solitaire. But he knew how this story would end. By 1971, pressure on the United States had become unbearable. Despite years of loyalty, even Britain, the most faithful ally, began to panic. The Bank of England requested a relatively modest $3 billion in gold to cover its reserves. It was a small request by historical standards, but the vaults were nearly empty. If the United States honored Britain's demand, there would be nothing left. President Richard Nixon convened his closest advisors at Camp David on the weekend of August 13, 1971. The discussions were short. There was no serious debate about saving the gold standard. There was no gold left to save it. On the evening of Sunday, August 15, 1971, Nixon interrupted the popular television show Bonanza. Millions of Americans watched as the president looked into the camera and delivered a decision that would reshape the world. He announced that the United States was temporarily suspending the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporary. The word was carefully chosen. That temporary suspension is now more than half a century old. With those words, the Bretton Woods system died. The gold window closed. Currencies floated. The dollar plunged. The final link between money and metal was severed. The consequences arrived exactly as Jacques Rueff had warned. The 1970s brought soaring inflation. Purchasing power collapsed. Gold freed from suppression exploded in price. The age of fiat money had begun. To the American establishment of the 1960s, Charles de Gaulle was a problem. He was portrayed as an anachronism, a stubborn relic of another era, obsessed with shiny metal, blind to the sophistication of modern economics. In the halls of Washington, he was dismissed as a nationalist who refused to accept the realities of a dollar-centered world. But history has a way of revisiting verdicts. Seen from today, the French strategy of the 1960s looks less like sabotage and more like one of the most successful trades in modern financial history. France exchanged paper dollars claims that would lose roughly 98% of their purchasing power over the following decades for thousands of tons of physical gold, gold that did exactly what gold has always done. It held its value. Today, France still possesses the fourth largest gold reserves in the world, totaling approximately 2,236 metric tons. Nearly all of it was acquired during the Great Conversion of the 1960s. At current prices, that gold is worth roughly $200 billion. Had France kept its dollars, the real value of those reserves would be a fraction of that sum. But the legacy of 1965 is not merely financial, it is philosophical. De Gaulle demonstrated something that modern economics often prefers to forget. International monetary systems are not neutral, they are designed. And they are designed to serve the interests of the power that controls them, the dollar system. Worked until it was abused, until deficits grew too large, until wars grew too expensive, until promises exceeded reality. When that happened, France chose exit over obedience. In doing so, de Gaulle reminded the world that monetary sovereignty is inseparable from political sovereignty. A nation that cannot ultimately control the settlement of its trade cannot be fully independent. In his memoirs, de Gaulle wrote a line that captured this truth perfectly: states have no friends, only interests. He was not writing about banking, but he might as well have been. In 1965, France chose its interests over its friendship with the dollar, and by doing so, it revealed the fragile foundation of the fiat money system that still governs the world today. The ships and airplanes of Operation 19 are long gone. The gold has been locked away deep beneath Paris, but the question de Gaulle forced the world to confront has never disappeared. When the next crisis comes, when deficits explode and printing presses accelerate, what will you want in your vault? A paper promise from a government buried in debt, or the supreme monetary law that carries no flag, no ideology, and no nationality?